All right, welcome to our lecture, How Political and Economic Institutions Influence Uneven Development Within States, and the slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture. So, first things that we want to talk about is, for instance, some of the regional differences and some of the ways in which governments can influence that. So, one of those key points you got to understand is that regional contrasts in wealth are a good reminder that per capita gross national income does not accurately represent economic development of individual places. Okay, so for instance, if we were to look at Africa, right, and Africa has a comparatively low per capita GNI as a region, but if we look at individual places within Africa, what we can see are actually some pretty high contrasts and some pretty dramatic changes across time, right? So, for instance, Kenya is actually significantly better off than a lot of other places in Africa in terms of per capita GNI, but you don't know that if you look at just the region, right? Or you don't necessarily get the idea that per capita GNI in Libya has actually gone down quite a bit since the Arab Spring if you're looking just at the region, okay? And the contrasts that we see between rich and poor areas, those differences that we see, are not just the result of the differences in the economic endowments, okay? So it's not just about what resources do they have available. Because the reality is a lot of the poorest areas of the world have some incredible resources. What it really comes down to is down to government policy. And not just government policy, but also government efficacy in enforcing policy. Okay? And efficacy is a way of saying how well they view their own ability to enforce policy and how well they actually enforce policy. And so that enforcement really ends up resulting in, if government's good at what it does, then it can dramatically raise the per capita GNI and increase the economic development. If government's poor at what it does, then what you see is a lot of a breakdown in terms of how that wealth is distributed, in terms of corruption and things like that. So these are all things to look for, and per capita GNI does not show that. In a way that ways that we would like. So when we talk about what do governments actually do when we're talking about economic development and the distribution of wealth within an area, things to look at are the role of tariffs, which are import taxes, okay, trade agreements, which could be between two countries or it could be between a bunch of countries, and typically those allow for some kind of discounts in terms of tariffs, speeding things through customs, things of that nature. Okay, but they could also it could also be punitive, so it could be a penalty-based system, right? Maybe we limit the number of things we allow in. You got to look at taxation structure, so who gets taxed, what gets taxed, how much do they get taxed? Okay, and these are huge. Look at land ownership rules, because some countries, for example, have rules that say only citizens can own land. And so that then impacts the ability of foreigners to come in and exploit the resources and things like that and to invest locally. And then you also need to look at the role of environmental regulations, which can either be really, really harsh or they can be really, really lax, and they could be, most places are somewhere in the middle, right? But very harsh environmental regulations can be very expensive to comply with, and so that can play a huge role in terms of whether or not people come in and want to try and develop resources and the like. Government policies, not only do they play an important role between countries, okay, so that's that interstate level, but they also shape the development patterns within states. So sometimes government policies encourage uneven development. For instance, they might have things like export processing zones, for example, that encourage development in a certain area. Or they can really push things so that, for instance, maybe they do like what Brazil did and move their capital from the from the edge of the country into the middle of the country to try and encourage and try and alleviate some of that uneven development. So try to encourage development in some of those underdeveloped areas. So really kind of a fun book to read, and one I'd recommend is The Travel of T-Shirts in the Global Economy. It's by a guy named a lady named Pietra Rivola. And it describes the significant influences governments have on the distribution of wealth between states, but also wealth within states. And essentially what she does in the book is they go around and track the T-shirt from the picking of the cotton all the way through to the store that it's sold in. Okay, and so, and talk about each step of the process, what that involves. So it's actually kind of an interesting book to read. You can get it at the local library. Within most states, right, they have what are called islands of development. And these are areas that are significantly more developed than other areas. Okay, a great example of this oftentimes is the capital city, because it's kind of the nerve center of the country. It's got the national headquarters. It's the seat of the government. And so it's very well developed around the capital city, and then it may be significantly less developed the further away you get. So this is, for instance, what I was talking about with Brazil, where they decided to move the capital city as a way of encouraging development further inland. Right? So in many countries in the global and economic periphery and semi-periphery, capital cities are by far the largest and most economically influential in the state. And we call those primate cities. It's not a term we're going to use very much this unit, but when we talk about urbanization and urban geography, keep that term in mind, that idea of a primate city. Okay? And then some of the newly independent states, so these are in Africa, by and large, some in Southeast Asia, right? Basically, we're talking about states that have been created within the 20th century. When we're talking about especially former colonies, what we're talking about is what they do is they move it away from the colonial headquarters in order to get away from that colonial mentality and to try and kind of do that very visual, very visceral break with that background. Okay. And what that can do is create an island of development, a separate island of development that's different from maybe what existed before. And again, that island of development is an area where a government or a corporation builds up, concentrates the economic development, and they focus it on a certain city or a small region. Right? Talk about the coast of China, for example, would be an island of development. We'll find some others around the world, I'm sure, but that's the one that's coming to mind right now. We talk about creating growth in the periphery of the periphery. So this is the poorest areas of the poorest areas, the poorest of the poor. Okay. A lot of times what you'll see are non-governmental organizations, we call those NGOs, that try to improve the plight of the people. And so what they're doing is they're trying to improve life for the people. And the reason why it's these non-governmental organizations that are doing it is because, by and large, the government in that area, for some reason, isn't as effective as it could be. All right. It might just be that the government doesn't have the money to be effective. It might be that the government is corrupt. Or that the leaders are inept, that they don't know what they're doing. Okay, lots of reasons why a government might not be effective, and non-governmental organizations oftentimes try to step in and fill that gap and create that improvement in terms of quality of life for people. Each individual NGO has its own set of goals, and those goals are really based around whatever the primary concerns are by the founders and by the financiers, so the people who are paying for it. Okay. So, it could be a focus on, say, eliminating malaria, or it could be a focus on getting girls to school, or on healthcare. Each one's going to have something slightly different that they focus on. And one of the more famous ones, we're talking about trying to create growth in the periphery of the periphery, and one of the ones that in many ways has proven to be very effective are microcredit programs, they're programs that give loans to poor people, particularly women, to encourage the development of small businesses. And the reason why they focus on women, don't take this the wrong way, boys, but oftentimes when you give the money to men, what they do is they may develop their small business, but then they don't reinvest the money in the community or in the family. in the same way that women do. So women build a small business, and they're likely to take the funds and use it to send their kids to school, for example. Okay. Whereas men are more likely to take the profits and do something like have a drink at the bar, or cigarettes, or maybe even reinvest in the business, just depending. But a lot of times what they're not doing is they're not investing in the family in a way that's going to help pull that family up out of poverty. Okay? And these have been paired very well with financial education programs. And when you see those two together, they become startlingly effective in terms of raising poverty rates. I was just reading a study the other day about that, actually. So some microcredit programs, they get credit for doing things like lowering birth rates, right? And they alter the social fabric of cultures. What they do is they really change it by changing who's got power in a given situation, right? So if a man's the only one who's working, he's the only one who's bringing in money, he's the only one who's supporting the family, that's a real strong position of power to be in terms of vis-a-vis his wife, right? If, on the other hand, she's now bringing in some money, she's helping to support the family, she's got some bargaining power because she can leave and know that she can support herself. Okay, so it really can change the social fabric of a culture, and arguably in a really good way, right, in terms of helping to modernize it, in terms of getting girls more education and things like that. For the most part, microcredit programs are really very successful, but they are a lot less successful in places with high mortality rates from diseases like AIDS. And the reason for that is simple, really, because if you loan somebody some money and then they die, the debt dies with them, right? So it's hard to collect if their family's already poor and doesn't have the money to pay it back. It's hard to get that money back then to turn around and loan it out to somebody else, right? So this kind of makes sense that this is the way this would work. So that's been our lecture about the role of governments in terms of encouraging or discouraging economic development. We talked a little bit about government policies, which are things like tariffs, trade agreements, taxation, environmental policy, right? And all of those have different effects, but very significant effects in terms of how a government encourages or discourages certain types of development. We also talked about how effective a government is in enforcing policies, and also how effective a government is in terms of delivering services and things like that to encouraging development. We talked about islands of development and how those can be influenced, for instance, by the decision to move a capital city or to encourage economic development in a certain area. Right. We also talked about microcredit programs and other NGOs that really try to encourage development in the poorest of the poorest regions to try and bring those up slowly but surely. And these are the people, to link it back to other things we've talked about, these are our folks who are living on less than $1.25 a day. Right? That's that extreme poverty level cited by the UN that we keep coming back to. And that's what a lot of the NGOs are trying to target. So they also try to target people who are slightly less poor, but a lot of them really, the goal is just to bring some of those folks up out of that extreme poverty. So if you have any questions about anything we've talked about, I'd be delighted to hear them. Please just let me know during class. I guess I will see you when the next time class meets.